Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you to two of my favorite Washington organizations, George Mason and CSIS, of which I've both been very happy to be associated with. I'm a bit at, in some ways, a disadvantage being at this conference because I don't really study Islam in Africa, but I think that's why I was asked to speak. I do study African politics and conflict in Africa, and so I'm continually encountering groups that are either labeled as Islamic or who self-identify as Islamic or who are networking with other Muslim groups. And so as I try to understand African politics, I have a particular way of particular set of questions, perhaps, that I ask of these groups, and I hope they are of some use as we work through the day. The first point I want to make has to do with regionalism versus globalism. When I was a graduate student during the Cold War, we Africanists were always bemoaning the fact that the Cold War framework that was overlaid onto conflicts like the Ethiopia-Somali conflict, let us say, or any number of other conflicts with the Reagan Doctrine, if some of you are senior enough, experienced enough maybe to remember that. And so to get attention, if you screamed, there's Cuban in those hills, there's Cubans, then you would get attention because there was a globalist framework that was being imposed on, or superimposed on, let me put it that way, on Angola and other places. Similarly, during the 1990s, when the global narrative, the global language was about the coming anarchy and the threats of hyper-nationalism, ultra-nationalism, largely coming out of the Balkans, concerns arising out of the Balkans, but certainly being appropriately used to explain conflicts and genocide in Rwanda, for example. Oh, it's Hutu extremists. That's the thing that you need to worry about. Hyper-nationalists are the problem. And in this post-9/11 world, increasingly it becomes the idea that there's extremism, that what you need to worry about is the radicalization of Islam. There's Wahhabis in the desert, and that's what you need to worry about. And so I start with that, not to say that these trends aren't important, and certainly not to say that these, to dismiss it as that's the only thing that you need to know. But there are these larger global questions, dynamics, language that then people like I who cover, try to understand Africa, often see superimposed upon very local, very parochial, very deeply historical conflicts. One other point, it's a reaction to Peter's starting point. In fact, I just referred to it with 9/11. When you're trying to understand the politics of Islam in Africa, you go back to an earlier phase, in particular in the Horn of Africa in Sudan, where you try to understand Nimeri and why he wanted to impose Sharia on a multi-religious, multicultural state, as he did before he was overthrown, and how the National Islamic Front in Sudan was trying to create some kind of a larger Islamic structure, only to become a fairly cynical, corrupt governing party at the moment. All right, I'm going to make two large points about Islam in Africa, relating to religion as a powerful mechanism of mobilization. On the one hand, a series of ideas or questions about why religion is so powerful as a means to mobilize disenfranchised and marginalized populations. And then second of all, how the weakness of the state in Africa and elsewhere in the world, a kind of a larger theme, shapes how we should maybe think about religion in Africa. In Africa, I hate talking about Africa because it's such a large, complicated, diverse area, but for the purposes of making these points, I will. There are certainly lots of grievances, lots of poverty, lots of marginalized people, but less sustained mobilization than you might think would be justified by the levels of grievance. And so to me, the question then becomes, does it seem to be easier to mobilize marginalized people around religion rather than around other forms of solidarity, other ways of people identify themselves, other ways that people relate to one another? And it seems to me religion is particularly well suited for a kind of a symbolic politics. That's one point I'll make. Religion is an area where there is an institutional capacity that is often lacking elsewhere. And religion gets linked to various, particularly transnational resources and the ability to mobilize resources. Religion, you know, I don't know anything about this that you don't know, but that it has a kind of intrinsic appeal to it, emotionally laden symbols and narratives and stories about who we are and where we came from. Often, most importantly, who we are and who they are. You know, it differentiates you to the others. Peter mentioned this idea of looking for authenticity. Religion provides a way to create that, or at least to express that. In this way, religion serves a purpose that in earlier days and in other places, and simultaneously in Africa, is taken over by ethnicity and nationalism serve similar purposes. Who am I? You know, why am I being treated this way? Why is the state marginalizing me? Can be understood through these frameworks of meaning. I think that maybe I will propose, and allow those who know Islam better than I to correct me, that conservative Islam, or Salafi, as Peter was describing it, has a particularly attractive mobilizing function. You know, because in parts of Africa are in a kind of a post-nationalist age. The nationalism of the 60s has not delivered what people wanted it to mean, and so nationalism is not the rallying cry that it once was. And so conservative Islam is able to position itself as a force, a voice of resistance, of anti-state. It's not the state, of militancy, of sort of categorical. There's yes and no. There's right. There's wrong. There's you know, that you don't have to live in a world of gray. But it's new. It's the newness. It's, as again Peter was saying about some of these more traditional, well-established Sufi brotherhoods, some of the Salafi groups, one thing you know for sure is it's not your father's Islam. There's something new here. And if what you're, as a young man or woman, you want to separate yourself from the earlier generation, these ideas are very powerful in that way. Secondly, under why religion is a particularly effective, particularly useful way to mobilize people, has to do with the capacity. In much of Africa, there are very few alternatives to religion in terms of non-state capacity. Labor unions, for example, so important to mobilization in North America and Europe, are largely, with some interesting exceptions, Zimbabwe and Zambia and some others, but are largely weak, divided, co-opted by the state. Civil society, again, weak, co-opted by the state. Opposition parties, very, very weak. But religion does have a structure. It does provide a modicum of space for people to mobilize, for people to speak about things that are important to them in ways that are not state-sponsored. Not only in terms of providing an arena for speech, but often much more nuts and bolts capacity as well. Places to meet, networks of communication, so that religious figures and Islam scholars can communicate new and fresh ideas through their own channels. And in that way, to give maybe a different set of ideas, the mosque can serve the purpose of the Catholic Church in solidarity in communist Poland, or the liberation theology of El Salvador, or the African American Church in the civil rights movement here. Thirdly, religion has a claim, or a particular global position when it comes to resource mobilization. Some of the story of Islam in Sudan, again, this earlier story of the National Islamic Front, is a story of Islamic banking and how Islamists, by being able to control Islamic banking, were able to control remittances from Sudanese who are working in the Gulf and so on. That it's not the religious. There's a political economy story, there's a banking story that explains why the National Islamic Front became so powerful in the Sudan. And these networks remain. There's powerful sources of wealth in other parts of the world, the Gulf, but not just the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, that are linked through some of these Al-Qaeda networks, whether it's to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb or Shabab or Boko Haram. We'll hear much more from people who understand these movements in a second. And so that does provide some increased opportunities for Islamist mobilization that matters. But again, this question of resources and political mobilization is not necessarily uniquely a religious story. I have, you can tell I have written a similar story about the Ethiopian diaspora and how that set of resources shaped the opportunities for opposition parties within Ethiopia. You could tell a similar story of Liberia or Senegal, or to leave Africa, about Tamil politics or Armenian politics, that there's lots of transnational money flows that shape homeland politics. It's not just an Islamic story. So, I mean, to me, as someone who studies politics in Africa, as I see things as diverse as nonviolent opposition movements like Ethiopian Muslims that Terry Ostabo will talk about later, or violent extremist groups like the Shabab in Somalia, or corrupt ruling elites like the national NCP in Sudan using Islam, my question is why does religion serve as an effective means to mobilize people and resources, to see this as a political story, and in that way try to understand Islam in Africa. I'll just make I'm going to drop my final point because I think it's the more obvious one, and that is the rise of Islam in Africa may in fact be better understood as the collapse of the secular state in Africa. That as the secular state and nationalism and some of the dashed hopes of some movements towards democracy and so on, that as the state has lost its legitimacy, that then there have been opportunities for Islam. So rather than thinking of African politics and conflict as Islamic extremism, to see it as the continued weakening of the state in Africa, and I say particularly the secular state, because the sources of legitimacy that have provided the rationale for the secular state, whether it was nationalism, whether it was democracy, whether it was the ability to deliver the goods, to the developmental state, for example, that is a source of legitimacy in Ethiopia and so on. In a number of places in Africa, those have come under great pressure, and so Islam rises in the absence of a political alternative. Thank you.